Perfect. Thank you. So tonight's talk is by Dr. MacInnes. Iain's a senior lecturer here at the UHI Centre for History, where he's taught for over 12 years. His main interests lie in the military history of the later medieval period, with a particular focus on the Scottish Wars of Independence, and particularly that second phase of conflict, which ran from 1332 to 1357. But about which is perhaps less known in terms of wider public understanding of the wars. He's interested in chivalry and conduct in war, as well as the impact of war, which informs part of his talk this evening, and is part of a growing consideration of the effects of war on different parts of the Scottish kingdom and on Scotland's communities. At the same time, he also has research interests in the themes of treason and its treatment, battlefield injury, and the politics of later medieval Scotland. In recent times, Iain has also developed an increasing interest in medievalism, the modern depiction of the medieval as it is portrayed in film, television, and in particular in comic books. And as you can see from the title slide there, his talk today is titled Haddington, East Lothian, and the Second Scottish War of Independence. Thanks very much, Iain.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That's great. And thank you very much for giving up your evening again. And thank you to everyone for coming out. It's great to see everyone. And I hope everyone has been enjoying those of you who are attending the event writ large, the festival fortnight. I hope you've been enjoying everything that's been going on. Okay, so a good number of people, I think, know about the First Scottish War of Independence. They'll be able to tell you something they know about William Wallace or Robert Bruce, about the battles of Stirling Bridge or indeed Bannockburn. And most will know that the war occurred, and some even suggest that it ended in 1328 with the peace agreed between Scotland and England. Of course, things didn't work out quite as well as intended, and that peace agreement lasted less than 4 years before conflict erupted once more. Additionally, those with knowledge of the First War will probably see it as a victory for Robert the Bruce, King Robert I. And the assumption that goes with that knowledge is that all Scottish problems were resolved by the time of the great king's death in 1329. But this is a simplistic description of events. The schism within the Scottish political community, that was in large part caused by Robert I himself when he murdered his rival, John Comyn of Badenoch, at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries, was not resolved by the time of his death. The king still had enemies in Scotland, as was demonstrated forcefully in the rebellion known as the Sewell's Conspiracy of 1320, the same year in which the Declaration of Arbroath was famously produced, proclaiming that all Scots supported good King Robert. Moreover, and in spite of various efforts on the king's part, there existed many individuals and families who had lost out as a result of wartime events. Some of these resided in Scotland. Forced to submit to Bruce at the point of the sword, they chose to bide their time until the king was dead. Others had fled Scotland in the wake of the king's victories, but they or their descendants almost all took up residence in England and waited for events to the north to swing back in their favour. The death of King Robert I in 1329, then, offered just such a defining moment of uncertainty for Scotland. So having left his kingdom in the hands of his 5-year-old son, who could not succeed to the throne for many years, power devolved to Bruce's close allies and supporters. But the Bruce cause had lost its figurehead, and those who had lost their lands and titles in the Bruce resettlement of Scotland in the 1310s and 1320s, a group known collectively today as the Disinherited, they smelled blood in the water and saw that their time of opportunity had arrived. Several of this group were closely allied to King Edward III of England and aided him in his own political machinations in seizing the throne in 1330 by overthrowing the governing regime of his mother and her lover. The English king owed the Disinherited for their support. He also despised the peace treaty that his mother had agreed with Scotland in his name, and he looked for ways to undermine the treaty. One way to do so was to sponsor and support the Disinherited. In so doing, he kept his own hands clean, To outward appearances, he was keeping to the terms of the Anglo-Scottish peace agreement. He could do little, he would argue, if Scots and Englishmen with claims to Scottish lands raised troops from England for money and employed them to win back their lands in Scotland. Nor could he stop the alternative claimant to the Scottish throne, Edward Balliol, son of the deposed King John of Scotland, from sailing to England to lead the disinherited in their endeavour. That Edward III had himself invited Balliol to England made little difference, as the English king sent out pronouncements that his subjects should not travel to Scotland to aid the disinherited. But go to Scotland they did. The disinherited, denied leave by Edward III to invade Scotland by land, sailed from the English port of Lynn in 1332 and landed at Kinghorn in Fife. They won early success and a large-scale battlefield victory at Duplin Moor near Perth, before being chased from Scotland at the end of the year. The disinherited returned the next year, however, and besieged Berwick-upon-Tweed. The Bruce response was to invade England, but this simply provided Edward III with all the excuse he needed to declare that the Bruce Scots had themselves broken the peace, and he marched north with a large army to join the siege at Berwick. These combined English and disinherited forces won another battlefield victory at Halidon Hill, just outside Berwick, in 1333, and Scotland was carved up between the victors. Balliol granted to Edward III the southern sheriffdoms of Scotland as recompense for the English king's aid, and these territories, for the next several years, were to be treated as part of England. King Edward of Scotland, meanwhile, would rule over the remainder of the kingdom. These were years, therefore, when the Bruce Scots, those supporters of the young King David II, who fled into a 7-year exile in France, fought what was effectively two wars. The first was against the English to win back southern Scotland. The second was against the disinherited and their allies as part of a renewed Bruce-Balliol civil war that reopened old wounds, restarted old enmities, and split the fabric of Scottish society once more. In this situation, different parts of Scotland experienced very different realities when it came to lordship, the direct impact of war, and the indirect consequences of the breakdown of central and local authority driven by internal dispute and the deaths of various lords in combat. East Lothian was in a particularly difficult position. The region had often felt the full force of war, sitting as it did on one of the main invasion routes from England into Scotland. Armies which mustered at Newcastle upon Tyne, and after 1333 at Berwick upon Tweed, often took the coastal route through East Lothian as a means to ensure that the army remained supplied by English ships, which shadowed the forces on their progress north. In the first year of conflict, however, the region may have missed the worst excesses of wartime damage, and this is because the disinherited, as already indicated, sailed to Scotland and invaded Fife. Their focus on this region, as well as on Perthshire, for Balliol set up his capital at Perth, and to have himself inaugurated king at Scone, saw the early weeks of war focused on this part of Scotland. Thereafter, the disinherited marched into the southwest, as Balliol struck back at Bruce attacks in the region and looked to raise allies amongst territories that were ancestrally loyal to his family. Thereafter, the disinherited headed east into the border region, and it was here that witnessed the majority of activity, with skirmishes taking place at Roxburgh and then later at Annan. Where the people of Lothian did have involvement in the war in 1332 was likely in the events surrounding the Battle of Duplin Moor. Having received intelligence of the coming invasion, the Scottish Guardian, Earl Donald of Mar, ordered that 2 armies be summoned, one from each side of the Forth. That way, the Bruce Scots would have forces in the field, no matter where the disinherited landed. The invasion of Fife ensured that it was the northern levies who would meet the disinherited forces at Duplin Moor, and which would be destroyed just outside Perth in the battle that followed. The southern levies, including those from Lothian, as well as local lords such as Earl Patrick of March, who led the southern army, made it as far as Auchterarder before hearing of the Bruce defeat. They went on to besiege Perth, but departed after several days of unsuccessful action, although the Scottish chronicler Walter Bower wrote positively about the Earl of March that he, quote, extorted his companions to seek revenge from the English. The Earl of March continued to fight in the skirmishes that followed, and was part of the Bruce forces that raided Galloway and ambushed Edward Balliol at Roxburgh and at Annan. Local Lothian landholders and knights of his retinue presumably accompanied him, and Lothian men may well have formed part of the forces that he took with him to fight in these efforts. The renewal of war in 1333 would, however, bring the war directly into this part of Scotland and directly to Earl Patrick's doorstep. For the Earl was created constable of the castle at Berwick-upon-Tweed in anticipation of the forthcoming disinherited English invasion, and he may indeed have taken part in the Battle of Haddington Hill, which was the culmination of these events around the town. At the very least, he led a reserve force of men from the garrison and town, and ultimately failed to march to surrender Berwick Castle in the wake of the Bruce Scottish defeat. Alongside the people of Berwick town and the surrounding region, Earl Patrick gave his fealty to King Edward III of England and King Edward of Scotland, according to one English source, in return for retention of his earldom. In the aftermath of Haddington Hill, however, it is likely that he had little option. Still, we should not assume that submitting to the English was all negative. The new order needed Scottish lords on side to administer and control newly conquered territories and to protect the inroads made in the aftermath of battlefield success. Those Scottish lords had to be kept sweet in order to ensure their loyalty over the longer term. And so at the end of July 1333, while King Edward III remained personally at Berwick, he granted to Earl Patrick of March £100 worth of land in England, quote, for his future good service. By March 1334, it is clear that the Earl was in receipt of 400 marks from the King, and in the same month he was given the right to seize the lands of his own tenants who had not come into Edward III's peace, and thus gained the financial benefit from them in the interim. This was following the transference of the whole of this region into the King of England's hands in early 1334 by Edward Balliol, and which reinforced that this territory was now ostensibly English. And that is approximately that area on the map there that's in that kind of checker effect. By early 1335, however, Earl Patrick had altered his allegiance once more, as English orders for the forfeiture of his lands make clear. This change of allegiance occurred, according to the English chronicler Thomas Gray, because the Earl had been robbed when travelling through Northumberland. Indeed, he was robbed of the very money that had been granted to him by Edward III. But when he went to Roxburgh to complain directly to the King, the Royal Council rejected his plea for compensation, and as a result, he formally withdrew his homage in a letter to the King when the latter passed through Lothian on his return to Berwick. The Earl's change of allegiance may also reflect the situation in Scotland at the time. 1334 was a period of widespread rebellion across the kingdom, and many of the disinherited were captured or chased from Scotland. Bruce forces were also operating in Lothian, and Earl Patrick may have used the story provided by Gray as an excuse to alter his own allegiance around the same time. The importance of giving some focus here to Earl Patrick of March is threefold. First, he was the largest landholder in East Lothian, and as such had interest in much of what was going on across these territories in this period. As a result, Earl Patrick is reflected most in the surviving evidence, and so there is an obvious corollary between what evidence survives and what we know. Second, Patrick of Dunbar was one of the few earls in this particular part of the world, the ancient earldoms of Scotland, which dominated the upper echelons of the Scottish nobility, being mostly located north of the Forth. As a result, Earl Patrick held a position shared by few others in this part of Scotland, or indeed in southern Scotland more generally. And this position ensured his importance in political, territorial, and military matters. He was the natural military leader for Lothian more generally, and in this period of intense wartime activity, local men would have gravitated towards his leadership and looked to him to provide such. Linked to this was the circle of lesser regional landholders, several of whom, like the Keiths, the Seatons, and the Craigies, were important men and military leaders in their own right, who formed the military following of Earl Patrick. These lords and local knights either were already or became part of the military retinue for the region, and during the Second War, it was these regional and lordly retinues which were the basis both for local activity, but also for larger regional and national efforts when such were required. And third, the position of Patrick of March's principal castle at Dunbar quite soon became a thorn in the side of the English occupation. Within the activities which took place over the next few years, Lothian became an increasing battleground. Bruce forces under John Randolph, the Earl of Murray, and William Douglas of Liddesdale campaigned in the region in 1335. Randolph, quote, to bring the southern Scots back to loyalty, while Douglas, quote, sought after much pillaging, killing, seizing, routing, and beating among the English, and had also prudently, bravely, and victoriously made war against them. Edinburgh and its hinterland would also be the location of a skirmish in the same year between the forces of Randolph and the European prince, Count Guy of Namur. Having travelled to England to participate in Edward III's summer campaign of 1335, Count Guy arrived after the king had already invaded Scotland. As a result, he rode north through dangerous territory with only his household knights for support, and was ambushed by the Bruce Scots at Boroughmuir. Fleeing to the apparent safety of Edinburgh Castle, the Continental forces found it still in ruins from the First War, and were forced to slay their horses to fill the gaps in the walls. They could not hold out, however, and duly surrendered. Murray was, however, a chivalrous captor, and indeed allowed the release of Count Guy, even choosing to escort him back to the safety of the border. However, this region was unsafe for the Bruce Scots also, and Murray was in turn ambushed by English forces, which defeated and captured him, resulting in a long period of captivity for the Earl. The English presence in Lothian was increasingly ramped up over this period. Edward III's winter campaign at Roxburgh in 1334-5 had refortified the castle there, and this provided a sizable garrison to Lothian's south. Berwick too was refortified and a notable garrison installed. The situation at Edinburgh, exhibited by the experience of the Count of Namur, may have reinforced to Edward III of the need to similarly fortify and reinforce Edinburgh Castle, and it had a garrison in it under the command of Sir Thomas Rosslyn from at least September 1335, before he was succeeded by the Anglo-Scottish commander Sir John Stirling. But what these troop increases ensured was that permanent English forces were stationed in the region, and that a network of fortifications was set up to provide support to each other. And the map here gives you the main examples, but there are several other castles, smaller castles held in between to give that real network of English-held garrisons. These garrisons were not sedentary, however, and provided a notable element of force projection. That is why they were predominantly made up of mounted warriors, including many, if not most, of the archers. Although evidence for Edinburgh is lacking, comparison with the garrison at Perth shows that the latter was involved in naval activities, patrolling the Tay estuary, as well as roaming through the surrounding countryside to ensure loyalty amongst the surrounding population. And the garrison at Edinburgh likely carried out similar operations. And we know, for example, that John Stirling took his forces across the Forth by boat in 1336, when Cooper Castle in Fife was besieged. It was the forces from the garrison at Edinburgh that relieved the siege and caused a panicked withdrawal by Bruce troops that included abandonment of their siege engines. The permanent settlement of garrisons in these fortified locations created a target and a further element of English administration that the Bruce forces had to work to take down if they were to recover this territory. As such, then, the years that followed were ones in which this region could be said with some justification to have become a war zone. And yet this did not stop Lothian men from taking part in the major endeavours of the day. One of the more significant, although smaller scale battles of the conflict was that fought at Coplane on St Andrew's Day 1335 in the forests of Mar, and indicated here on the map in the north. Here the disinherited claimant to the earldom of Athol, David Strathbogie, was defeated and killed, bringing to an end his efforts to subjugate and control much of northern Scotland for both himself and the Balliol cause. One of the leaders of the Bruce forces who defeated Strathbogie that day was Earl Patrick of March, who presumably led the group of, quote, 800 picked men from Lothian and the borders, which are referenced by 15th century chronicler Walter Bower as fighting in the battle. Still, they would be needed back in Lothian soon enough, as the region was increasingly fought over by both sides. The refortification of Edinburgh Castle and the activities of its garrison soon attracted the Bruce Scots to besiege it. Andrew Murray and his forces attacked the castle in later 1337, and while there, quote, the community of Lothian accepted his authority. Stated as it is by a Scottish chronicler, this in itself may not mean very much in reality. Local surrenders to attacking forces while they were in the area was surely nothing new, and such pledges of loyalty could change quite quickly depending on circumstance. But this particular surrender was added to by Murray's creation of Lawrence Preston as the Bruce Sheriff of Lothian. This was arguably a real statement of intent, and suggests that Murray was expecting Preston to make his position a reality by means of conflict within the area. Of course, this appointment would have come as a surprise to the English Sheriff of Edinburgh, John Stirling, who as Constable of Edinburgh Castle also served as Sheriff for English-occupied Lothian. That military activity followed this attempt to introduce a Bruce Sheriff into an English-occupied zone is reinforced by Bauer's comment that, following Preston's appointment, quote, there followed the total destruction of Lothian both by the Scots and by the English. This bare statement likely hides a quite violent reality. The realities of medieval warfare did not play out against a background of winning the hearts and minds of local people to ensure their loyalty. Instead, both sides used more of a shock and awe approach to matters. Violent warfare was employed as a means to force loyalty to one side or another, usually involving the burning of crops, the robbery of goods and livestock, and the general devastation of large areas of agricultural and the urban environment. The alternative was to levy protection money from the local populace to be left in peace for a time, but with a promise of a return visit in the future to exact further sums if that protection from violence, from one side at least, was to be of longer duration. This form of warfare demonstrated forcefully to the people on the ground that whoever they owed their loyalty to was not providing that element of protection that was part and parcel of the social contract of medieval life. For landholders and tenants gave their toil, their service, and their loyalty to those further up the social chain. In return, however, their lords were meant to protect them. Violent attacks demonstrated that that particular lordship was not perhaps worth having, and so loyalties were effectively up for grabs. But in the sort of situation faced by the people of Lothian in this period, when the forces of both sides were warring over the land and each causing as much destruction as the other, it must have been impossible to see a way that ensured long-term safety and security. In such circumstances, then, people perhaps had to pick a side and stick with it and face the consequences, or perhaps prevaricate in a vain effort to please all sides and similarly face the consequences, or indeed flee to seek safety and security elsewhere. And indeed, it's clear that in some parts of this region, this is in fact what happened, with a refugee population on the move as it sought to escape the violence of war. John Stirling's sheriff accounts of the money he was able to raise from English-held lands in Lothian shows a return of nothing at all from the town of Linlithgow in the period of his account, a situation that appears to have been caused by the absence of much of the town's population at the time. On a side note, it also appears that serving as Sheriff of Lothian was not the safest of occupations, although not all examples were directly relevant to the events in the region. So Thomas Rosslyn, who had been the first constable at Edinburgh Castle when it was first installed in 1335, was killed in a skirmish at Aberdeen a year later. His successor, John Stirling, was captured in a skirmish with forces under William Douglas of Liddesdale near Bathgate in 1337-8. As we shall see shortly, he was threatened with death as a result before ending up a Bruce prisoner. And Lawrence Preston was killed in a skirmish in 1338. Rushing to face English reinforcements, which crossed the border at this time, he and his men won a victory, but not without the loss of Preston himself, who, according to Bauer, was, quote, pierced by a lance through his mouth to his brain. This is a rather nice example of chronicle evidence being useful in providing historians with an idea of the types of injuries sustained by medieval warriors and their ability, or not in this case, to survive such, which is a topic I've written about elsewhere. But the events in which Preston was killed are described by Bauer as taking place around those of perhaps the largest military event to occur in Lothian throughout this period of conflict, namely the siege of Dunbar Castle in 1338. As part of the ongoing struggle for control and dominance in Lothian in these years, the place of Patrick of March remained key. As indicated earlier, his change of allegiance to the Bruce side back in late 1334 was likely a blow to Edward III of England, even if he didn't necessarily recognise it as such at the time. For Patrick's control over his own territories was strong, and so the English sheriffs of Edinburgh and Berwick made little inroad into his area of interest. Indeed, English administrators complained bitterly that various lands that should have owed them money were inaccessible to them because they were held by Patrick and his followers, to the extent that the English administration had no power to unseat them or to collect revenue. More than this, Patrick is stated to have engaged in that very Bruce activity of collecting protection money from those in the surrounding districts who were loyal to the English or who had given their loyalty to them in order to be left in peace. Indeed, the English Lanarkos Chronicle wrote at some length about how, quote, in 1337, Dunbar Castle was still in the hands of Patrick, having neither been besieged nor taken by the English. And the whole of the surrounding district of Lothian, although it was then in the King of England's peace, paid each week 1 mark to those within the castle, more, it is thought, out of fear lest it should be forced from them than from love. As with the discussion had already about the tactics of the war and the way in which both sides prosecuted a form of psychological warfare against the people of Scotland in order to force their adherence and loyalty, Patrick's efforts in Lothian were to the significant detriment not only of the people of Lothian, but also the English administration in the south of Scotland. As the Lanarkos chronicler went on to note, Dunbar Castle itself was, quote, irksome and oppressive to the whole district of Lothian. As a result, the decision was made to invest significant men and resources in besieging the castle in 1338, in what was to be the defining element of that year's campaign season. Of all the events of the Second War of Independence of relevance to this particular part of Scotland, the siege of Dunbar is perhaps the most well known. This is because of the accounts of the siege which revolve around the actions of the person in charge of its defence. And this was Agnes Dunbar, formerly Agnes Randolph, Countess of March, and known to history as Black Agnes. She was not the first noblewoman to undertake such an effort during this conflict. Indeed, she was at least the third, following the examples of Christina Bruce at Kildrummy in 1335, and the disinherited noblewoman Catherine Beaumont at Lochindaub in 1336. Agnes was, however, the noblewoman about whom the most was written, due to the vigour she apparently displayed in leading Dunbar's defence. Walter Bauer, in his Scotta-Chronicon, relates a series of tales that emphasise Agnes's involvement in the siege and bring her to life as more than simply a stock character of medieval history. For example, Bauer noted that Countess Agnes, quote, ridiculed the invaders wittily with gestures and words, for after an engine had thrown a missile which made the towers tremble, while the Earl of Salisbury looked on, she arranged for a very pretty girl to be sent, adorned like a bride for her husband, who with a white piece of cloth or handkerchief held in her hand would wipe and gently rub the place of impact. When the Earl of Salisbury had a siege engine known as a sow created to protect his troops with covered access to the castle walls, Countess Agnes in turn had a stone launched from one of her own siege engines, which struck the sow and dashed to pieces those sheltering under it. She apparently mocked the English once more by crying, Montague, Montague, beware, for your sow will farrow. And when the Earl of Salisbury thought he had gained entrance to the castle by bribing one of its gatekeepers, the tables were in fact turned, and almost led to the capture of Montague himself. He was only saved from his fate by the quick thinking of the English knight, John Coplane, who pulled the Earl out of the way and was captured by the Scots instead. Bauer wrote again of Countess Agnes, deriding the English attackers, calling adieu, Monsieur Montague, to the relieved Earl. While the English forces lay before Dunbar Castle, however, the Bruce Scots were busy elsewhere. Alexander Ramsay of Dalhousie led a raid across the border, potentially in an attempt to draw the besiegers away from the siege. William Douglas of Liddesdale was active in Lothian as well, and ambushed forces from the garrison of Edinburgh Castle when they were raiding the local countryside. amongst those captured was none other than the garrison's commander, Sir John Stirling. Deciding to make use of his captives, Douglas took them back to Edinburgh and displayed them to the remaining garrison within the castle. He demanded their surrender, offering them safe conduct to return to England with their lives and goods if they did so, but threatening to execute every one of his prisoners if they did not. The garrison, however, called Douglas's bluff and refused. Contemporary notions of good behaviour meant that Douglas was required to provide safety to his prisoners after their capture and surrender, as long as they were noble, of course. And the garrison likely knew this and could be relatively safe in the knowledge that Douglas would not carry out his threats. And indeed, he did not, and sent his prisoners off to captivity instead in Dumbarton Castle. Interestingly, though, these actions may have had a direct impact on a very similar event that occurred soon after. For John Randolph, the Earl of Moray, in English custody after his capture in 1335, was brought similarly before the walls of Dunbar Castle, in much the same way as John Stirling had been at Edinburgh. Randolph was the brother of Countess Agnes of Dunbar, and it was assumed pressure could be put on her to surrender if she wished no harm to come to her sibling. But the Lanercost Chronicle, echoing the view of her provided by Bauer, reported that Countess Agnes refused to surrender on the basis that Dunbar was her husband's castle and not that of her brother. More than that, as she went on to say, if the English executed Earl John, then that would simply result in her becoming heir to the Earldom of Moray because her brother had no children of his own. And so, just as with William Douglas at Edinburgh, the English did not carry out their threats and instead returned the Earl of Moray to his captivity in England. The siege of Dunbar dragged on until June 1338, but the Earl of Salisbury had abandoned it by the end of April. Edward III was preparing to take ship to sail to the continent, and Montague, as one of the king's key noble supporters, did not want to miss out. The other English lords at Dunbar felt similarly, and so made a series of truces, and then a final peace, that allowed their departure for England, and then on to the Low Countries, as what became known as the 100 Years' War entered its initial phases. After 6 months of siege at Dunbar, its garrison had successfully held out, and as the chronicle evidence suggests, much of the credit for that went to Countess Agnes. What occurred during the siege, though, is less well known. Chronicle evidence does not provide the day-to-day actions of that large English army camped outside the town. But comparative evidence from elsewhere would suggest that English forces ranged far from the site of their encampment to raid the surrounding countryside. This had two benefits. First, it supplied the besiegers with food and other supplies, which was important in case seaborne reinforcement was interrupted by the weather, by accident, by supply problems, or indeed the fact that Edward III was at the same time gathering naval forces for an invasion of the continent. Secondly, such raids deprived the besieged of any chance of supply reaching them from local sources, and also denied supply to Bruce supporters in the region, and reinforced once again that the English side was the cause to back at this point in time. And so, while we don't have specific evidence that Haddington was targeted during the events of the Siege of Dunbar, it seems highly likely that the town, or at least its hinterland, was targeted for raiding and attack by English forces during this period. Lying only 11 miles to the west, it was well within striking distance for mounted English forces looking to control the territory surrounding Dunbar. It was also on the route west to Edinburgh, where William Montague, Earl of Salisbury, was forced to travel to reinforce Edinburgh Castle following the capture of John Stirling. Moreover, considering the discussion had already about Bruce counterattacks against English offensives, then this territory may also have been subject to Scottish attack, as Bruce forces sought to undermine the activities of the English siege. Lawrence Preston's already discussed death occurred in a skirmish with English reinforcements on their way to Dunbar, making clear that Bruce forces were operating in the area. And the rise at this time of Alexander Ramsay of Dalhousie, himself leading forces amassed from Lothian and the borders, ensured that even with a large English army active in the region, Bruce activity remained potent. Ramsay himself took a ship and sailed it to Dunbar, bringing supplies to the garrison and offering the chance for him to sally out with his men and skirmish with the besiegers to some success. In the same year, the nature of Bruce warfare and the tactics involved in such is reinforced by the words of Walter Bauer, who wrote, following the death of Guardian Andrew Murray, that the latter had, quote, reduced all the regions through which he passed during his expeditions to such desolation and scarcity that more perished through hunger and extreme poverty than the sword destroyed from the time of the outbreak of the war. Considering the previously suggested nature of this region as a war zone, it would seem sensible to consider that this type of suffering, caused both by Bruce as well as English assaults and activities, was also prevalent in Lothian. And this was the reality for much of southern Scotland during at least the period of the 1330s. Only as the English invasions lessened after 1338 and the Scottish south increasingly fell back into Bruce's hands following the capture of Edinburgh Castle in 1341 and Roxburgh Castle in 1342 did matters change. And although things would take two steps back, following the large-scale Bruce battlefield defeat at Neville's Cross outside Durham in 1346, and an English presence would return to southern Scotland again, it was on a different scale. So too was the Bruce resistance to that English return, as things became far more piecemeal and warfare became extremely localised in nature. And while this doesn't mean that things became any less violent, that the people of the region didn't suffer as much as they'd perhaps done 10 years before, it does mean that the record of the conflict in the later 1340s and 1350s is far less well recorded, and so unfortunately also less well known. Direct reference to Haddington in this period is evident, however, in two cases of it being targeted for specific attack and violently despoiled by disinherited English forces at the two chronological ends of the conflict. So the English Moe Abbey Chronicle notes that the market at Haddington was raided, quote, by the English around the end of March 1333. This took place during the siege of Berwick upon Tweed, but the reference to the English being responsible is not wholly accurate. Berwick was, at this time at least, being besieged by disinherited forces as a resumption of the civil war of the previous year. As yet, then, this remained a largely Scottish affair, although that was soon to change, of course, as Edward III would enter the conflict following Bruce's Scottish raiding on northern England around the same time. The Moe Abbey Chronicle stated that the raid on Haddington Market despoiled it of its goods and that the forces involved killed any Scots that they found. And this raid may be the same one, although Haddington isn't mentioned specifically, that the English Lanercost Chronicle records as being led by David Strathbogie, who, quote, being young and warlike, raided the neighbouring country with his following and supplied the army with cattle. The second raid was the infamous Burnt Candlemas of February 1356, when Edward III punished the people of the region for forcing him to return to Scotland from France as a result of the Bruce capture of Berwick town. Following the king's recapture of Berwick, Edward III, quote, stayed at Haddington and in its vicinity for 10 days, where he awaited his ships to supply him. These were sunk in a storm off North Berwick, and so the king's raid was curtailed due to lack of supply. Still, this did not remove completely the opportunity for destruction. Walter Bower provides some detail about the campaign that followed. He wrote that Edward III and his troops burned, quote, the borough and the whole monastery and famous church of the Friars Minor at Haddington, a building work that was undoubtedly costly and wonderfully beautiful, and the one source of comfort for the whole of the countryside, whose choir indeed was commonly called the Lamp of Lothian, on account of its remarkable beauty and brightness of the light within it. Bower's editors note that this Franciscan church lay along the banks of the River Tyne, on the site of what is now the Holy Trinity Episcopal Church. Interestingly, English chroniclers do not mention Haddington at all, and not even all Scottish chroniclers do, so Andrew Winton's chronicle doesn't. And so it's likely that Bower's sources were using local knowledge to inform their account of this incident. Meanwhile, in another example, English administrative evidence places Edward III in Haddington on the 16th of September 1335, although he appears not to have spent very much time there on a journey between longer stays at Edinburgh and Coburn's Path. Beyond these specific historical instances, though, Haddington came under the control of the English crown from June 1334 as part of the parcel of southern Scottish territories handed over to the English king by Edward Balliol. The administration of Lothian is quite interesting, as while there was an overall sheriff for the region as a whole, the Sheriff of Edinburgh, the region was obviously too large for the control of one man. Therefore, it was envisaged that the western and eastern parts of the region were created into constabularies based around Linlithgow and Haddington. The English retained this administrative structure when they took over. And even for a short while, English administrators fulfilled the various roles in the area. So on the 15th of June 1334, John Kingston was appointed to take seizin of all the lands which Balliol had granted to Edward III in the town, castle, and sheriffdom of Edinburgh, along with the constabularies of Haddington and Linlithgow. On the 21st of June of the same year, John Burdon was appointed as Chamberlain for the town and sheriffdom of Edinburgh and the constabularies associated with it. And in 1335-6, Nicholas Prestwick, Hugh Riston, and Adam Pye were named as bailiffs of Haddington. As with English administrators across the country, these men produced a decent amount of paperwork. And considering the often limited survival of similar Scottish evidence, such records provide us with a wholly new source of information for what was going on in Scotland at this time. Indeed, the sheriff's accounts for this region provide a snapshot of events on the ground for the period of 1335 to 1337. It is unfortunate that they only cover this 2-year period, but it remains that such record evidence provides great value in terms of historical investigation. So, for example, it records a series of escheats, lands forfeited to the English crown because of being taken from their Scottish owners, thus giving us good insight into the names and number of locals who refused to surrender surrender to or work with the English administration that took over the region. This includes major landholders such as the Bishop of Dunkeld, who lost his lands at Aberlady, which, along with the church of the town, were handed instead to William Bullock, a disinherited Scot, who later became Constable of Cooper Castle in Fife. The Bishop of Dunkeld at this time, however, was William Sinclair. Although a loyal Scot during the reign of Robert I, and a man who the king referred to as his fighting bishop, Sinclair does seem to have changed allegiance in the early years of the Second War, and was in attendance at Edward Balliol's coronation at Scone in 1332. This forfeiture in 1336 suggests that he had, by this time at least, changed allegiance again, but he's one of many figures whose allegiances changed over several years, depending on which way the political wind was blowing. Also included amongst the forfeited are Patrick Earl of March, unsurprisingly, who lost lands at Howden, Whittingham, and Rochlaw. There's Maurice Murray of Drumsargard, who lost his lands at Ballincreef. There's Robert Lauder, who lost his lands at Bulgowan, Newton, Papel, Whitelaw, and Garvold, and William Keith, who lost his lands at Bonington. There are also longer lists of lesser landholders of various local surnames who were also deprived of their territories. And amongst these is a number of local women, which provides an interesting snapshot of who held lands at this particular point in time, including the lands of Alderston, forfeited by Margaret and Joanna Fraser, profits from the lands of Drem, forfeited by Alice Fenton, who also forfeited the lands at West Fenton, territories in Longnidry, held by Muriel Carleton, lands at Loughness, held by Elizabeth Bickerton, a tenement at Peaston, held by Mariotta Lauder, the daughter of Robert Lauder, and the lands of Christian Eglin at Stenton and Trinent. As with the case of William Bullock, already noted, there are one or two occasions where lands are reassigned to friendly individuals rather than being retained in the king's hands. Interestingly, these include the English crown allowing 40 shillings from the profits of the lands of Burns to be given to the nuns and convent at North Berwick, as this was part of a standing grant by Alice Lindsay from her husband's now forfeited lands. This might be as a result of King Edward III's own personal piety, which was demonstrated at various times during his campaigns in Scotland, including in a grant of £10 in 1336 to the prioress and nuns of Manuel Priory near Linlithgow. It might also, of course, have been a means of ensuring loyalty from the religious communities of southern Scotland through continued royal largesse. Further, a grant of half a carucate of land in Drem and half an acre of land next to the Church of Haddington was granted in July 1336 to the Prior of St Andrews, suggesting that he, and perhaps his whole priory, had entered the King of England's peace, and thus been rewarded. Again, financial gain was a potential benefit of English allegiance, and Scotland's religious communities were particularly susceptible to the economic vagaries of wartime, and so sought relief where they could find it. Still, not all religious individuals and communities were so easily bought, and there is the record of the Abbot of Curus, who had been forfeited the proceeds of the ferry at North Berwick as a result of his contrariousness. What the English sheriff's accounts also give insight to is the state of the land at this time. For in various cases, the sheriff was able to account for little, if anything, from lands which should have been quite profitable. As we've seen from Berwickshire, this was not always because lands were in a state of disrepair. The inability of the Berwick sheriff to collect profits from lands belonging to the Earl of March was for the simple reason that he was still clearly in possession of them at the time, even if the English crown believed them to be forfeit. What was declared by the crown and what occurred in reality depended very much on the situation on the ground, and March does seem to have been particularly successful in digging in and denying English administrators access to his territories. This was perhaps easier in those territories to the south of Dunbar, however, and thus somewhat further out of reach of the Sheriff of Berwick, than it was for his lands scattered across Haddington Constabulary. So the Sheriff of Edinburgh accounted for 5 shillings collected from the Earl's lands at Crocky, near East Lothian, in 1336, and this sum had increased to 9 shillings in 1337. Similarly, 3 shillings was collected from Rosslyn in 1336, and 10 shillings from the same territory in the following year. And 33 shillings was collected from the Earl's lands at Whittingham in the first year of collection. The first two, at least, however, were not exactly huge sums of money, and notably the sheriff does not state, as he would in relation to other territories, how much the lands were meant to be worth, suggesting perhaps that any profit was better than none at all. The latter was certainly the case in regards to the Earl's lands at Markle and Traprain, which provided nothing at all in either year, although the sheriff was able to collect proceeds from a mill at Overmarkle in the second year of his account. In regards to lands which produced nothing, or which were noted by the sheriff and his team as waste, we are left with a series of questions. Had these territories been victim to the raids of the period? Had they been abandoned by tenants who had sought safety elsewhere? Or, like some of the Earl of March's other territories, were these simply lands from which nothing could be collected, either because they were still in the hands of the enemy, or because tenants refused to comply with the demands of the new administration? Unfortunately, we cannot know, but the changing state of play over the 2 years of the accounts can suggest change over time, as well as highlight cases where things were depressed and indeed where they remained so. So the Sheriff of Edinburgh was successful in raising some returns from Robert Lauder's forfeited lands at Balgone. In 1336, this amounted to £7, 13 shillings, 1 pence, and a year later this had increased to £8, 10 shillings. This remained, however, much less than the lands were actually worth, which amounted to £26, 13 shillings, 4 pence, suggesting that raising money still proved difficult, or that these territories had indeed been damaged before the time the sheriff began his accounts. Elsewhere, greater success for the sheriff can be seen in the lands of Maurice Murray at Ballincreef. In 1336, these returned 111 shillings, but a year later they produced the full value that the lands were worth, namely £11, 2 shillings. This was, however, one of only a few success stories from this period. John King's forfeited tenement at Burns returned nothing in either year because it was, quote, totally waste. John Brocksmith's lands at Brocksmith similarly produced nothing in either year, as they were, again, totally waste, as did William Oliphant's lands at Hedderwick. And 2 brew houses at Castleton, the proceeds from which were forfeited from the Earl of Fife, produced a return in 1336, but lay waste by 1337, suggesting that the brew houses themselves had been targeted in the intervening period and damaged or destroyed. Indeed, such examples of agricultural and industrial infrastructure were prime targets for raiding forces, as they could be damaged quite easily by fire, but would take a significant length of time and investment of resource to re-establish them. Indeed, Jonathan Gledhill, in his 2009 thesis on the nature of political society in South East Scotland across the medieval period, noted that 52% of the towns of the 1336 account were waste or returned at no profit. And although this figure decreased to 32% a year later, many of the returns which were produced were for negligible amounts, and as noted already, were well below the actual value of the lands involved. English possession of this particular part of Scotland was not, therefore, as financially advantageous as might be expected. And considering the expense that was spent paying for garrisons, invading armies, and the numerous other costs of wartime, it begs the question of whether it could ever be a profitable enterprise for the English crown. To conclude then, this talk has only been able to provide an overview and selected examples from this period of conflict. but it has provided a good deal of specific evidence for the experience of East Lothian during this period of conflict. Of course, we have more evidence for the 1330s than we have for the 1340s and 1350s, and so the focus is more often on the earlier period than the later one. And while the bulk of large-scale action took place during the earlier period, and so we can tie the existing documentary evidence to our better narrative of events in the 1330s, it does not negate the fact that we simply know less as the period goes on. And this should not be taken to mean that warfare ceased, or that the suffering that accompanied it for Lothian's population receded overly much. In the period after the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, the English and Edward Balliol returned. Balliol burned his way through Lothian in 1347 in a campaign meant to subdue the populace and reinforce the post-Neville's Cross reality. English forces reinforced this later in the same year, and English administrations once more sought to take over the running of the region. English people were brought in to take up residence in the area to provide for a friendlier population, and it seems like something akin to the 1330s returned. But we do not have the record evidence to accompany this, and so it's unclear if this return in the 1340s and 1350s was actually as significant as it might seem. Moreover, apart from the 1347 raid and the burnt Candlemas destruction 9 years later, we don't know much about how intensively this region was fought over by either side. Alongside the reduction in administrative evidence, chronicle and other narrative sources have less to say also. English sources, in particular, increasingly focused on the 100 Years' War, while Scottish sources are problematic because of when they were written and the knowledge they had at their authors' fingertips. As indicated, warfare became increasingly localized and small scale. As such, then, it perhaps escaped the attention of those writing the histories of this period, and so has left us with rather little to go on. But while English garrisons remained at Roxburgh and Berwick, as they would do for decades and indeed longer, East Lothian was a region within easy striking distance, and as a result, it would remain under the English shadow for at least quite some time to come. Thank you very much. Stop sharing. Stop that.